Most of the US is going to be under a big dome of heat this week. Oh my gosh. I'm going to give you guys, I think 5 or 6, maybe 7 tips on how to keep your bees cool. Look at my weather station. It says right now 93 degrees, and it feels like 100 degrees. And I'm glad I got this pretty heavy duty windscreen on right now because it's very windy too. Things are going to dry out fast. Well, how should you be concerned about your bees? You need to be very concerned about your bees. Now, a lot of you might feel like, hey, I think my bees will do fine. Bees were getting along long before man put them in a box. We didn't have to do anything back then when bees were on their own, and now we have bees in boxes. You're telling me I need to be worried about them? Absolutely. Here's why. When bees are in their natural habitat, like a tree, they're in the forest, they're in the woods. And forest, wooded area, it's shaded in the trees, and so they have the shade. Now, we don't like to keep our bees out we don't like to keep them in the shade, well, because we are fearful they'll have more small hive beetles. So we put them out in direct sunlight where the sun's really going to heat them up. Secondly, in the tree, their natural habitat, not only are they in a shaded forest, but the tree is usually 3 to 6 inches thick, the actual bark, the edges of the tree before it gets into the hollow part of the tree where the brood nest would be. So they have all that insulation from the heat, and they don't have that when they're in our little 3/4 inch thick pine boxes or plastic boxes. They just don't have the insulation that they do in their natural habitat. So I would be very concerned. I'm very concerned, and I take action when I see that it's going to be heat indexes getting up around 100 degrees. Because what happens, bees really can't do much else except they try to forage for water. So in other words, they just don't go out and get a lot of nectar when it's so hot, because all hands on deck, they have to go out and get water and bring it back to the hive. Not because they're thirsty, they don't drink water like we do, but they actually take the water that normally they'd be carrying nectar in their honey crop, they fill it up with water, bring it back to the hive, and they disperse water droplets onto the developing brood, that pupae. And they fan their wings, and that's what's called evaporative cooling. That's amazing. That's how they cool their hive. And they can run 1 gallon of water, it's estimated, guessed I guess, but guesstimated, but they run 1 gallon of water per day over the brood nest area and evaporate it for that evaporative cooling. So whatever we can do is going to help them a lot. Now, I've heard some people say things, and I read a comment on my YouTube channel where somebody said, well, when you're in your house and it gets really hot, you can turn the air conditioner on, you don't go upstairs and open up the upstairs windows. I'd like to address that comment because I live in a farmhouse that was actually built here in Illinois in 1867. And most of it is still original. They have added on to the bottom, I think in the 50s. But the idea is, and the reason they put windows upstairs is because it gets too blasted hot up there, you can't stand to be up there. So all the heat in a big house, it just goes up into the top rooms. In fact, when we had our house filled up with our children had to suffer up there because it was way too hot. And so, yeah, we had to open the upstairs house. Now, you would think with the air conditioner on, central air, no, you don't have to do that. Bees don't have central air. They live in a house like I live in. And so without central air, all the heat gravitates toward the top of the hive. We trust that, and we enjoy that during the winter. We don't like it much in the summer. So I always advocate ventilation. Got to have some, like your bottom entrance needs to be open. And then I always say you need to have some vent at the top to let the heat out, because that's what would help the bees so much. Now, if you look at your hive, I'm going to give you guys, I think 5 or 6, maybe 7 tips on how to keep your bees cool. If you look at your hive on a hot day, you'll see 2 things that are going on. Number one, you might see a lot of bees on the outside, the front of the hive, or in the evening when it's hot and humid, they'll be bearding, it's called, on the bottom board, maybe onto the ground. They'll form a beard and they will hang off the bottom board. That's the way that they have to get bees out of the house. Too many people in here, too hot, we need to cool it off. Some of you would go outside and hang out on the porch. But the other thing is they'll line up behind each other, rev up their wings, and draw air out of the hive. They're pulling air out when you don't have any upper vent. They're making these wind tunnels all the way up where the heat is and sucking it out and blowing it out of the front because it's building up too much heat in the top of the hive. That's why I believe in putting something under your top cover to raise it up just a little bit, and that will cause a lot of good ventilation. Now, let me get my tips out of my phone here. I jotted them down earlier, and I think this is going to be really helpful to you. So the first thing that we need to think about is shade. Now, the best way that I make shade in my hives that are way out in the open, because I want them to have a lot of sun for less small hive beetle, I cut something 4 by 4 foot by 4 foot, and put it on top of the hive, and then put a cinder block on top. Now, this is really helpful because what it does, it creates a shade over the sides of the hive between the hottest times of the day. That's a big help. Before we get into the next tip, let me encourage you to please join me for my live stream every Thursday, 7 p.m. Central Time. We have giveaways. We have spin to win the wheel. You can win things or funny things happen. And it's just 59 minutes of more fun than you can tolerate. So join me every Thursday, 7 p.m. Here's a link right here in the description too. Now let's get back to the next tip. Number 2, the second thing is you got to provide water. Again, they're using water for evaporative cooling. So you got to have a bird bath with some rocks and sticks or something in it. No need to put sugar water in it. If you do, it's only going to be used to help them find it. But once they find it, just go to water and keep it filled up. It's going to evaporate pretty quick on hot, windy days like today. Once they find it, make sure they have access to water. The third thing is, like I just mentioned, you need ventilation. I like to put a dime, a nickel, or a quarter under the top cover, between the top cover and the first box, whether it's a deep or a super, and that's going to provide just enough space to allow some passive ventilation. And so that's going to be a big help to provide some ventilation. Now we have several more tips coming up to help you guys keep your bees cool during the heat wave. And before we do though, let me encourage you to please subscribe, give me a thumbs up, click on the bell, and you'll be notified each time I work hard and make you another helpful video like this. Hit subscribe. Now let's get back to these heat tips, keeping your bees cool. And the next tip, number 4, is spacing. Now, if you kind of got your hive crowded, it's usually a good thing because, you know, bees like to be in a crowded space. Obviously, if you crowd them too much, they can swarm. But if you give them too much room, then what happens is things like small hive beetle and wax moths can really go unpoliced, and they will start to lay eggs and things in parts of your hive where bees are not guarding that area. So you don't want to provide too much space. But if your bees are really crowded right now, like they have 2 deeps that are just packed full of bees and a super packed full of bees and nectar honey, might be time to put another super on to help disperse some of that heat. It helps the heat rise a little bit further away from the brood nest area. So think about your spacing. That's going to help a lot. Push comes to shove, red alert, and something is just absolutely beyond what you can do to cool them off. Like if you live in the deep south where it's just unbearable hot, or maybe out west where it's unbearable hot. Ironically, this year, this heat wave now is going to be more in the Midwest toward the Northeast. And so it can strike all of you that maybe aren't used to having such heat. And so one of the things you can do, tip number 5, you can move your hives into the shade. Now that's really kind of hard to do. It's heavy. You got foragers that know where their home is. It's hard to move hives. But if it's going to save the hive, then you might need to cowboy up and get a buddy or a partner or somebody to go out there with you. And I'll leave a link in the description below how you can move a hive, how I move them very quickly with things that I have at home. You don't have to have a fork truck and all that. I'll show you how I like to move hives. But you can move them into a shaded area, and you know, that's going to help you a lot. And that's, again, that's an emergency, like it's unbearable. That's when I'm going to move them if my comb is melting. If it's so hot that inside the hive they can't cool it, brood is dying, comb is melting, okay, red alert, we're going to move it. Otherwise, I'm not going to move it if it's just hot and they're not dying and things aren't melting. And the final thing I want to share, if it's convenient, you can water the hive down 2 or 3 times a day. Now, I realize you might have to be close enough to a water hose, or you might have access to, like, I don't know, like a trash pump, they're called, and get a water tank, and you can go out to your apiary, just start spraying some hives down. That will help cool. You know, like if you're really hot and you pour water on yourself, It doesn't take long before you're pretty cold. It cools you off, so it could help in that way as well. So those are 6 tips, because again, when you're thinking about your bees and you think they're going to be okay, they probably might be okay, but the heat is still going to set them back. And we've worked so hard this spring to get them going, and so we want to do our very best to keep our bees cooled down in this hot spell this week. And even if it cools off, summer hasn't even started yet when I'm publishing this video. So we have a lot of months left of very potential hot weather. So I need all of us to really be thinking, how in the world can I help cool my bees down? This is going to be so important. Now, if you want to watch a video, I think it's going to be really helpful for you guys. It's a video that I made on how to expand your hive. Some of you may be frustrated that your hive isn't growing as fast as it should be. Got a video for you right here. Helpful tips, I love it, on how to expand your hive. I love it because I wish I'd have known this when I first started. See you over there.